They say being a good man is the ultimate goal, the blueprint for a happy life, the golden ticket to a happily ever after. But standing here in the biting chill of a Tuesday night, watching my life's work being tossed into the back of a rusted pickup truck, I've realized that being a good man was actually my greatest sin. In the eyes of the woman I gave 7 years of my life to, my kindness wasn't a virtue, it was a weakness. My devotion wasn't romantic, it was pathetic. I was the golden retriever husband, loyal, constant, and apparently incredibly easy to kick to the curb when a real man came barking. I'm sharing this because I know there are guys out there right now cooking dinner, rubbing their wives' feet, and working double shifts just to buy that designer bag, thinking they're building a future. I need you to listen closely to my story because the line between being a supportive partner and a doormat is thinner than you think. Have you ever given someone your entire soul only for them to tell you it wasn't manly enough? Before we dive into the wreckage of how my marriage dissolved in just 6 months, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm reading every single one because tonight I just need to know I'm not the only one who got lost trying to be the nice guy. And if you've ever been through a betrayal that felt like a car crash you saw coming, but couldn't stop, hit that subscribe button. We're going to get through this together. My name is Sawyer, and until 6 months ago, I thought I was the luckiest man in the world. I married Sloane when we were 24. She was everything, sharp, ambitious, and beautiful, in a way that made me feel like I'd won the lottery every time she looked at me. I spent our entire marriage trying to be the man she deserved. I was the guy who remembered every anniversary, the guy who had coffee ready before her alarm went off, the guy who supported her through 3 different career changes without a single complaint. I thought that by being her safe harbor, I was being her hero. But about a year ago, the atmosphere in our home started to shift. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing leak. Sloane started spending hours on her phone, her face illuminated by the blue light of social media, scrolling through lifestyle influencers. At first, it was just fitness and travel. Then the algorithm started feeding her something darker. She started watching these modern woman podcasts and alpha male lifestyle coaches who preach that a woman's peak is wasted on a man who doesn't dominate her. "You're just so predictable, Sawyer," she told me one night. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen after a long day at work, and I'd brought her a glass of wine. I expected a thank you. Instead, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and boredom. "You're like a golden retriever, always there, always happy, always waiting for a pat on the head. Don't you ever want to just take control?" I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just a bad mood. I thought if I worked harder, if I was even more attentive, she'd see my value. I didn't realize that every time I apologized for something that wasn't my fault, or every time I stepped back to let her have her way, I was losing her respect. To Sloane, my emotional intelligence was just a lack of testosterone. The signs of betrayal began to stack up like unpaid bills. She started staying late at the office, but her work stories didn't add up. She changed her passcode. She stopped mentioning me in her Instagram stories, scrubbed our vacation photos, and started dressing in a way that was meant for someone else's eyes. And then there was the name that kept popping up, Creed. Creed was the local embodiment of every alpha stereotype. He drove a blacked-out SUV he couldn't afford, wore suits that were too tight for his ego, and posted videos of himself at the gym talking about conquering the world and discarding the weak. To me, he was a walking red flag. To Sloane, he was the real man she'd been brainwashed to crave. The climax of my ignorance happened on a Friday evening. I had planned a surprise weekend getaway to the mountains, her favorite spot. I'd spent weeks saving up for this. I came home early with flowers and a printed itinerary, only to find the house smelling like a cologne I didn't own. The air felt heavy, charged with a tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. I walked toward our bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't find them in bed. I found something worse. I found Sloane sitting at her vanity. Her phone propped up, recording a voice note to her group chat. She didn't see me in the doorway. Honestly, girls, it's like living with a wet blanket. She said, her voice dripping with a cruelty I didn't know she possessed. Sawyer is literally downstairs, probably making a kale salad right now. He's so soft, it makes me sick. Creed took me to that underground club last night and actually made me feel alive for once. He doesn't ask for permission, he just leads. I think I'm done playing house with a puppy. I need a king. The flowers in my hand felt like lead. I didn't drop them. I placed them carefully on the hallway table. The silence in the house was deafening. When she finally turned around and saw me, she didn't look guilty. She didn't apologize. She looked at me with a cold, clinical detachment, as if I were a piece of furniture she was ready to replace. "Oh, you're home," she said, standing up and crossing her arms. "Good. We need to talk, and I don't want you to do that thing where you try to communicate and understand my feelings. I'm over it, Sawyer. I'm over us. I need a man who challenges me, someone who doesn't make me feel like I'm the one wearing the pants in this relationship. Creed is moving in on Monday. I've already filed the papers." The world tilted on its axis. Monday, the papers. She had been planning this for months while I was busy trying to make her favorite pasta from scratch. I looked at the woman I'd loved since I was 20, looking for a shred of the Sloane I knew. She wasn't there. In her place was a stranger who had traded a decade of shared history for a hashtag and a hollow promise of dominance. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to be the alpha she wanted just so she would stay. But that's not who I am. I am Sawyer. I am the guy who cares. And in that moment, seeing the absolute disgust in her eyes as she looked at my trembling hands, I realized that the man she wanted didn't exist, and the man she had was someone she never deserved. "You want Creed." I finally managed to whisper my voice, cracking in the cold air of the bedroom. "The guy who leases his life and rents his personality. You're throwing away 7 years of marriage for a man who won't even remember your birthday." Sloane let out a sharp, jagged laugh that cut deeper than any insult. "He doesn't need to remember my birthday, Sawyer. He makes me want to earn his attention. You just give yours away for free. That's why you're a golden retriever, and he's a wolf. Now please stop making this pathetic. My bags are packed and Creed is waiting in the driveway to help me move your stuff into the garage." I walked to the window. Sure enough, a massive blacked-out SUV was idling at the curb. Creed, the wolf. I turned back to Sloane, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. I wasn't losing a wife. I was being evicted from a life I had built with my own 2 hands. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I walked to the closet, grabbed an old duffel bag, and started shoving the first things I could touch into it. I zipped the bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked past her without looking back. As I reached the front door, the cold night air hit me like a physical blow. I walked down the porch steps, the wood creaking under my feet for what I knew would be the last time. My car was parked at the end of the driveway. a humble sedan that looked tiny next to Creed's monster truck. I could hear them laughing behind me, the sharp sound of Sloane's excitement mixing with Creed's low chuckle as they began to haul my remaining boxes out onto the damp grass. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the gravel beneath my boots as the first drops of a cold gray rain began to fall, drenching the cardboard boxes of my memories. The rain didn't just fall, it seeped into my skin, turning my clothes into a heavy, freezing second layer that anchored me to that driveway. Every drop felt like a silent insult hitting the cardboard boxes where my life had been hastily packed. I gripped the handle of my duffel bag until my knuckles went white listening to the metallic thud of the SUV's tailgate slamming shut behind me. That sound was the final gavel, the closing ceremony of my marriage. I didn't turn around to watch them go inside. I didn't want to see the lights flicker on in the kitchen I had renovated with my own sweat, only to see a stranger's shadow crossing the floor. I just climbed into my sedan, the interior smelling of the stale air of a life that no longer existed, and drove. I ended up in a studio apartment on the edge of the city, a place where the walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor's microwave beeping, and the carpet carried the faint, lingering scent of cheap cigarettes and regret. For the first few weeks, I existed in a state of sensory deprivation. I would come home from my job at the architectural firm, sit on the edge of a twin-sized mattress that leaned to the left, and just stare at the peeling wallpaper. The silence was the worst part. In the house with Sloane, there was always noise, the hum of the dishwasher, the TV, her voice talking about her day. Here, the only sound was the radiator clanking like a dying machine. I was mourning more than a woman. I was mourning the version of myself I had spent a decade cultivating. I had been the fixer, the provider, the man who stayed calm so she could be chaotic. Now I was just a guy in a 12 by 12 box with a leaking faucet. I found myself spiraling into the alpha rabbit hole she had left me for watching the same videos she had watched, trying to understand what I lacked. I saw men in expensive cars telling me that my empathy was a biological failure, that my desire to nurture a relationship was feminine energy that repelled high-value women. For a while, I believed them. I hated my own reflection. I hated the softness in my eyes. I considered throwing away my books, my cooking equipment, and everything that made me me just to rebuild myself into a statue of granite and ego. But the digital world offered no escape, especially since Sloane refused to let me heal in private. Even though I had muted, her mutual friends would sympathetically send me screenshots of her new life. It was a curated gallery of my replacement. There was Creed shirtless in a mirror captioned with "King Energy Only." There was Sloane draped over his arm at a club, her eyes glazed, but her smile wide for the camera captioned, "Finally found a man who knows how to lead. No more playing safe." Every post was a deliberate jab, a way to ensure that even from a distance, she was still the one holding the leash. The true rising action of my nightmare began about 2 months in. I was struggling to keep my head above water at work. My designs were losing their edge because my mind was trapped in that driveway. One afternoon, I received a notification from my bank. The joint savings account, the one we had agreed to split fairly during the mediation, had been drained. $42,000. Gone. I called Sloane, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. She picked up on the 5th ring, the sound of loud music and Creed's barking laughter in the background. "The money, Sloane. Where is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "Oh, Sawyer, don't be so dramatic." She sighed, and I could practically hear her rolling her eyes. Creed had this incredible investment opportunity, a high-stakes crypto mining venture. He needed the capital to get us to the next level. Since you're so stable with your little office job, I figured you didn't need it as much as we did to build our empire. Think of it as an exit fee for all the years I spent being bored with you." "That was for my firm's startup costs," I whispered. "That was my future." "Your future was always small, Sawyer." She snapped, her tone suddenly venomous. "Creed is a lion. You're a house pet. Lions don't ask for permission to eat. Don't call me again unless it's about the final decree. I'm busy living." The line went dead. That was the moment the golden retriever died. Not out of hatred, but out of a sheer cold necessity for survival. I looked at the gray walls of my studio and realized that if I continued to be the nice guy who waited for karma to do the work, I would end up as nothing more than a footnote in her destructive path. I had to change, but not into the alpha monster Creed was. I had to become something else, a man with a spine of steel and a heart behind a locked gate. I started small. I blocked every mutual friend who sent me updates. I deleted the apps. I stopped looking for why she did it and started looking at what I was going to do. I poured that suppressed, agonizing energy into my work. I stayed at the firm until the janitors arrived, redesigning a commercial complex that had been stalled for months. I stopped eating frozen meals and started training not for aesthetics, not to look like a wolf for Instagram, but for the raw, primal discipline of pushing my body until my mind stopped screaming. Meanwhile, the cracks in Sloane's empire were starting to show, though I didn't know it yet. I caught a glimpse of it one evening when I was leaving the gym. I saw Creed's SUV parked outside a liquor store. He was arguing with someone on the phone, his face purple with rage, shouting about margins and respect. He looked stressed, frantic, and remarkably small without the filters of a smartphone camera. The alpha was sweating. I felt a strange sensation, not joy, but a chilling lack of empathy. I didn't care. I realized that the leadership Sloane craved was actually just a lack of impulse control. Creed wasn't a king. He was a gambler playing with other people's chips, and Sloane was his biggest bet. As the months ticked by, my professional life took a turn I hadn't expected. My firm's senior partner noticed the shift in my demeanor. I wasn't the yes man anymore. I was direct. I was precise. I was the first one in and the last one out. He offered me a lead position on a multi-million-dollar project in the city center. It was the break I had been dreaming of for years, the kind of opportunity that required a golden retriever's attention to detail, but an alpha's refusal to fail. I threw myself into it, building a new identity out of blueprints and cold coffee. But betrayal has a way of circling back for one last bite. Just as I was beginning to find my footing, I received a series of frantic, typed-out emails from Sloane's sister. She told me things were getting dark. Creed had lost the investment money within weeks. He had convinced Sloane to take out a second mortgage on the house, my house, to cover his debts. He had become erratic, blaming her for his failures, telling her she wasn't supportive enough of his vision. The wolf was starting to bite the hand that fed him. I read the emails and felt nothing. Then came the night that changed the trajectory of my recovery. I was working late in my studio when my phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number. Sawyer. The voice was thin, reedy, and stripped of all its former arrogance. It was Sloane. "Sawyer, please don't hang up," she sobbed. "He's gone. Creed took the SUV, the rest of the jewelry. He even took the laptop with all my work files. The bank. They sent a notice today. They're foreclosing Sawyer. They're taking the house in 30 days. I have nowhere to go. I don't have a cent left in my name." I looked at the blueprint in front of me, a design for a building meant to stand for 100 years. "Why are you calling me Sloane?" I asked, my voice as flat and emotionless as a paved road. "Because you're the only good person I know," she whispered. "You're so kind. You've always been there. I made a mistake, Sawyer. I need you to help me talk to the bank. I need a place to stay just until I get back on my feet. Please. I'm scared." The golden retriever in me felt a phantom itch to console her, but that part of me was buried under layers of scar tissue. I remembered the rain in the driveway. "I can't help you, Sloane," I said. "The Sawyer you knew died in that driveway," I replied. "You wanted a man who takes what he wants. Well, I want my peace, and you aren't part of it." I hung up. A few days later, I was driving through our old neighborhood. I slowed down as I approached the house. It looked desolate. There was a bright orange notice of default sticker plastered on the front door. As I passed, the front door opened. Sloane stepped out onto the porch. She wasn't wearing the designer clothes from her Instagram posts. She looked toward my car, and for a split second, our eyes locked through the windshield. I didn't stop. I simply adjusted my grip on the steering wheel, leaving the image of her standing on that crumbling porch in my rearview mirror. The image of Sloane standing on that porch, framed by overgrown weeds and the neon orange sticker of her own ruin, didn't haunt me the way I expected. Instead, it acted as a strange sort of fuel. As I accelerated away from my old neighborhood, the engine's hum drowned out the ghostly echoes of our past arguments. My hands didn't tremble on the steering wheel this time. I felt an eerie, surgical precision in my movements. I wasn't running away. I was moving toward a version of my life that didn't require her permission to exist. The rearview mirror showed her figure shrinking into a tiny, desperate speck until the road curved and she vanished entirely. By the time I reached my office, the sun was dipping below the skyline, casting long amber shadows across the glass facades of the city. I went straight to my desk. My colleagues had already left, but the silence here was different from the silence in my studio apartment. This was the silence of progress. I laid out the blueprints for the city center project, my fingers tracing the sharp, intentional lines of the foundation. Architecture is about weight, knowing how much a structure can bear before it collapses. I had finally learned my own load-bearing capacity. The next 4 months were a blur of high-stakes meetings and late-night site visits. I traded my golden retriever habit of people-pleasing for a reputation of being unshakable. When a contractor tried to cut corners on the steel grade, I didn't understand his perspective. I shut him down. When a client tried to push a deadline that would compromise the integrity of the design, I didn't apologize. I stood my ground. People started looking at me differently. It wasn't because I had become a loud-mouthed alpha like Creed. It was because I had developed a quiet authority that didn't need to bark to be heard. But as my professional life ascended, Sloane's descent reached terminal velocity. The empire she thought she was building with her wolf had turned out to be a house of cards in a hurricane. Without the luxury of my paycheck or the stability of my credit, her life had stripped back to the bone. Every few weeks, a piece of news would filter through the cracks of the city's social circles. Creed hadn't just left. He had cleared out her remaining dignity. He'd apparently moved on to another woman, someone younger, someone with a fresh bank account to drain using the exact same king and queen rhetoric he'd used on Sloane. I was sitting in a high-end bistro celebrating a successful zoning approval when my phone lit up with a string of text messages from a number I had neglected to block. It was an old friend of ours, someone who had gone silent during the divorce. "Sawyer, you need to know. Sloane was evicted this morning. The sheriff showed up. She's at a motel on the edge of town, but her card declined. She's literally on the street with her bags. She's been calling everyone, but nobody wants to get involved because Creed owes half this town money and they think she's in on his scams. I looked at my steak, perfectly seared, and the glass of expensive red wine in my hand. A year ago, I would have dropped my fork, paid the bill, and driven 100 miles an hour to find her. I would have played the hero. I would have been the safe harbor once again. But as I sat there, the only thing I felt was a profound sense of exhaustion at the thought of her drama. The golden retriever was not just dead. He had been replaced by a man who understood that some people have to hit the absolute bottom before they stop digging. I didn't reply to the text. I finished my dinner, tipped the waiter generously, and walked out into the cool evening air. A week later, I was leaving a late-night site inspection. The project was in a gritty part of the downtown area currently under redevelopment. As I walked toward the parking garage, I saw a figure huddled on a bus bench near a closed-down convenience store. It was a cold night, the kind of damp Philadelphia chill that gets into your marrow. The figure was wrapped in a thin, pilled blanket surrounded by 3 large, bulging trash bags. I slowed my pace. My heart didn't race, but a cold knot of recognition formed in my stomach. It was her. Sloane looked nothing like the woman I had married. Her skin was sallow, her eyes sunken and rimmed with red. She was staring at her hands, which were cracked and dirty. She was just a woman sitting on a bench in the dark, waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. I stepped into the circle of light cast by the flickering street lamp. Sloane. She jumped her head, snapping up with a look of pure terror that slowly melted into a devastating, soul-crushing shame. She tried to pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Sawyer." Her voice was a ghost of itself, cracked and trembling. What? What are you doing here?" "I work nearby," I said, keeping my distance. "I heard things were bad. I didn't realize they were this bad." She let out a sob that sounded like a physical tear in the air. "He took everything, Sawyer. He told me I was dead weight because I didn't have any more assets to contribute to his mission. I'm so tired, Sawyer. I'm so cold." She looked at me, then her eyes swimming with a desperate, manipulative hope. Can I just stay on your couch for a few days?" she pleaded. "Just until I get a job. I'll do anything. I'll clean, I'll cook. I just need a door that locks. Please, Sawyer, for old time's sake. You're a good man. You've always been a good man." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see my wife. I didn't even see an enemy. I saw a lesson. Being a good man is why I'm standing here. "Sloane," I said, my voice steady and quiet, "but being a smart man is why I'm not letting you into my car. You didn't just leave me. You humiliated me. You traded our life for a man who treats women like disposable batteries." "I was wrong," she screamed. "I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." "That's the thing about alphas and wolves, Sloane," I replied. "They only care about the pack as long as the pack is strong. Creed did exactly what a wolf does. He left the injured behind. I was the one who would have carried you, but you didn't want to be carried. You wanted to be hunted." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. I took out all the cash I had, about $300, and walked over to the bench. I set it down on top of one of her trash bags. "This is for a hotel tonight and some food," I said. "And tomorrow I'll call a social worker I know through the firm. But that is all I can do for you. I am not your safe harbor anymore, Sloane. I've sold that harbor and built a fortress instead. You're really going to leave me here, like this, after everything?" "I'm not leaving you," I said, turning away. "You left yourself a long time ago. I'm just continuing my commute. As I walked toward the parking garage, I could hear her sobbing behind me. I reached my car, settled into the leather seat, and gripped the steering wheel. I started the engine and began to pull out of the garage. I didn't look back again. I thought about the golden retriever husband I used to be and the fortress of a man I was becoming. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing her suffer. It was reaching a point where her suffering no longer had the power to derail my life. I arrived at my apartment complex, a sleek, modern building. The phone on the counter buzzed. It was an email from my lawyer. The final divorce decree had been signed and processed. It was over. I stood there for a long time, watching the world wake up my mind, already drifting toward the challenges of the coming day, while the memory of the woman on the bus bench began to fade into the gray fog of the morning. The first rays of sunlight hitting the floor-to-ceiling glass of my new penthouse didn't feel like just another morning. They felt like a final benediction. I watched the golden light wash over my hands that no longer shook hands that had spent the last few months drafting a new skyline while my old life was busy tearing itself apart. On the marble kitchen island sat the final divorce decree, a simple stack of paper that carried the weight of a 1,000-ton anchor finally being cut loose. For the first time in 6 months, I didn't feel the phantom itch of a wedding ring. I felt the clean, cold air of a man who had survived a shipwreck and finally learned to love the shore. I spent the early hours of that morning in a state of deliberate, meditative calm. I prepared a meal not because I had to serve someone else, but because I deserved the nourishment. I savored the scent of fresh espresso and toasted sourdough, enjoying the absolute stillness of a home that belonged entirely to me. There were no alpha manifestos playing in the background, no snide comments about my predictability, and no heavy silence of a woman who was already halfway out the door. Just me. But as I sat there, the memory of Sloane on that bus bench kept flickering in my mind like a dying light bulb. I knew that the golden retriever in me wasn't entirely dead. He was just under new management. I made one final phone call. I contacted a local nonprofit that specialized in emergency housing for women in crisis. I didn't give them my name. I simply gave them Sloane's location and her full name, and I authorized a one-time anonymous donation to cover her intake fees and 6 weeks of transitional housing. "Is there a message you'd like to leave for her?" the coordinator asked. I looked at the divorce papers. "No," I said. "No message, just the opportunity." I hung up, and in that moment, I felt the final thread snap. I wasn't her savior, but I wasn't a monster either. I was just done. I deleted her number, cleared my call logs, and walked out to my car. The day at the architectural firm was a triumph. The city planning commission presentation went flawlessly. I stood at the head of a mahogany table surrounded by the city's power players and spoke with a clarity that came from having nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. I realized then that Sloane and Creed were fundamentally wrong about what makes a man real. It's not the ability to dominate or the loud, fragile display of alpha energy. It's the ability to withstand a Category 5 storm and still have enough integrity to build something beautiful for others. As the week progressed, the closure I had been seeking arrived in a way that was both shocking and deeply sobering. I received a series of frantic emails from an old college friend who still moved in Creed's circles. The Alpha Empire hadn't just cracked, it had detonated. Creed's high-stakes investments were revealed to be a classic Ponzi scheme. He had been using the money from women like Sloane to pay off earlier investors while leasing his lifestyle to maintain the illusion of wealth. When the house of cards collapsed, Creed didn't lead or protect. He fled. He was caught trying to cross the border into Canada in a stolen vehicle carrying a suitcase of cash that belonged to people he had ruined. The most gut-wrenching part, Sloane wasn't just a victim. She was being investigated as a potential accomplice because her name was on the second mortgage and several fraudulent bank documents Creed had forced her to sign in the heat of their romance. The wolf had used her as a human shield before abandoning her to the hunters. I read the news reports and felt a profound, heavy sadness. Not for the loss of the woman, but for the loss of a soul who had traded everything for a lie. I saw a photo of Creed being led into a courtroom in handcuffs. Without the designer clothes and the lighting, he looked small, terrified, and remarkably ordinary. He wasn't a wolf. He was a scavenger who had finally run out of scraps. A month later, I was walking through the park near my office when I saw a woman sitting on a bench feeding the pigeons. It wasn't Sloane, but for a second my heart skipped. It made me realize that I was carrying a burden of choice. I had chosen to let her face the consequences of her actions. I had chosen my peace over her rescue. And this is where I want to stop and talk to you, the people who have been following this journey from the beginning. This is where my story ends, but yours begins in the comments. I've been reading your theories and your support, but now I want to address the elephant in the room. My decision to leave Sloane on that bench has sparked a lot of debate among the few friends who know the full story. There are two very different ways to look at how I handled the end of my marriage, and I want to know which side you fall on. Perspective 1. The cruel transformation. Some people argue that by turning her away when she was homeless and broken, I became exactly what I hated. Perspective 2. The necessary boundary. On the other side, there are those who believe that letting her back in would have been a betrayal of myself. So I'm putting it to you. Was I too cold? Did I lose my humanity in the process of finding my spine? Or was my no the most alpha thing I've ever done, not because it was loud, but because it was final? I'm looking at the comments right now. Tell me, would you have opened that car door, or would you have driven away just like I did? Let's get into it, because I think we all need to know where the line between good and weak really lies. As for me, I'm standing on my balcony now watching the sun set over a city that I helped design. I think about the man I was 6 months ago, the man who would have apologized for the rain. I don't miss him. I've realized that you can be a good person and still say no. You can be a kind soul and still demand respect. And most importantly, you can be a golden retriever who knows exactly when to stop wagging his tail. Thank you for listening to my unspoken journal. My name is Sawyer. I'm no longer the man you can break. I'm the man who survived, and for the first time in my life, that is more than enough. I'll see you in the comments.